Hi, I'm Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS Legal Hotline Lawyer. And in this video, I want to talk about a question that has come up a lot lately, which is when I am a listing broker and I am approached by an unrepresented buyer, what do I need to do with that buyer with respect to agency agreements, providing them forms, requiring them to get their own representation? Let's cover all of those questions. When you are approached by a person who says, I'm interested in buying your seller's property, you're the listing broker, I'm interested in buying your seller's property, you are always going to ask them, are you represented by another real estate broker? And if their answer is no, then you're going to say, very first thing you're going to do, and this is a requirement of Washington's agency law, you're going to hand them a copy of the agency law pamphlet, the new agency law pamphlet, effective January 1st, 2024. You're going to hand them a copy of that pamphlet because they are an unrepresented buyer. And then, beyond what the law requires, because that is what the law requires, beyond what the law requires, you should also engage in best practices, which require that you advise the buyer that they are unrepresented and that you represent the seller exclusively. And you should advise them to get representation. And when you get home that night after everything else is unfolded, assuming that buyer wrote an offer or assuming you're moving forward somehow with that buyer as an unrepresented buyer, then I want you to follow up that whole conversation in a provably delivered written communication. So here's what I mean. You're going to get back to your computer that night and you're going to send an email to this buyer. And you're going to say, dear buyer, it was nice meeting you today. Attached, please find a copy of the agency law pamphlet. I provided this to you earlier today, but for ease of reference, it is attached to this email. I wanted to remind you of the conversation we had today. That conversation included your disclosure to me that you're unrepresented and my responsive disclosure to you that I represent the seller exclusively, that you are in fact unrepresented in this transaction. You assured me that you wanted to continue representing yourself, and my advice that you get independent representation, whether it be from a lawyer or another real estate broker. You declined that invitation or that advice. And so buyer, attached, please find, and then maybe you wrote an offer for that buyer. Attached, please find the offer that I will be presenting to the seller tonight. Please let me know your availability for a phone call to learn what the seller's response was. Something along those lines. Is the buyer going to respond to that email from you? 100% they're going to respond to that email from you. Why? Because they want to give you the time when they're going to be available to hear what the seller's response was to their offer. Once they respond, now you have provably delivered the agency law pamphlet to this unrepresented buyer. You have disclosed to them that you represent the seller exclusively and they're without representation, and you've advised them to seek representation. Some brokers will say, but wait a minute, couldn't I represent the buyer? Absolutely. You could represent the buyer. You could be a limited dual agent, assuming you want to be a limited dual agent, and further assuming both the seller and the buyer consent to you being a limited dual agent. If you were going to be a limited dual agent, seller should have already initialed the paragraph in the listing agreement consenting to you being a limited dual agent, and then buyer will have to sign a buyer agency agreement with you before you write buyer's offer. And in that buyer agency agreement, buyer will also have to consent to you being a limited dual agent. If you aren't going to be a limited dual agent, that's fine. You can write this offer for buyer as the seller's exclusive agent. You don't have to have a buyer agency agreement with the buyer since you already have an agency agreement or a services agreement with the seller. In fact, if you enter an agency agreement with the buyer, then you are a limited dual agent. And unless that's what you intend, and again, unless the parties have consented to it, then you can't enter an agency agreement with that buyer. But you certainly can, after giving that full disclosure and advice to the buyer, you can write the offer for the buyer based on the buyer's instruction to you about the terms they want to include. Brokers will often ask me, well, what if the buyer doesn't know how important it is, for example, to include an inspection contingency? Should I tell them to include an inspection contingency? Brokers, if you represent the seller exclusively, then you cannot counsel, coach, or advocate on behalf of the unrepresented buyer. All that you can do is write the terms of the offer that the buyer instructs you to write. Some brokers will ask, well, should I just give forms to the buyer for the buyer to write the offer? No. Buyer's not trained in how to use those forms. You are. And if you write an offer based on the buyer's instructions, and it's not something that the seller wants to or should accept, then you are going to counsel and coach the seller. And it may be that the seller chooses to rewrite the offer in the form of a counter offer back to the buyer, and that would be fine. But you, as a seller's broker, will be the one who writes that offer, and you can either write it based on the buyer's instruction, or you could tell the seller, this buyer wants to purchase your property, although it's backwards from the way most transactions work. Seller, would you like me to write an offer for this buyer to accept? Either way, if you're the only broker in the transaction, then you're probably going to be the one who writes the offer. Remember when you do that you're going to disclose on the face of the purchase and sale agreement that you represent the seller and the buyer is unrepresented. And below the buyer's signature, where it comes to the broker information, you are not going to identify a buyer broker because there isn't one. Some brokers will ask me the question, can I just simply tell buyer, sorry, I won't write the offer for you if you're unrepresented? You have to go get representation. You either have to go hire a broker or hire a lawyer to represent you in this transaction, or else I can't move forward with you. Absolutely not. What you would be saying to that buyer is, although I have a duty to my seller, a continuous ongoing duty to make a good faith effort to find a buyer, and even though I have a buyer standing right in front of me for seller's property, I am going to create a financial obstacle for this buyer, requiring this buyer to go hire and compensate another industry member or a lawyer before the buyer is allowed to purchase my seller's property. When I say it that way, which is the way a judge hearing this case would probably hear it as well, it probably sounds pretty obvious that that would be a bad idea. You cannot put up a barrier telling the unrepresented buyer they must get representation before you, as a seller's agent, will actually help the seller sell their home. This is an issue that's coming up a lot today. I'm not sure it's actually happening on the ground, maybe sometimes. It's a question that I do think will develop more over the course of time in reality, and right now it's on the minds of a lot of brokers. So if you have questions around this topic or any other, please feel free to ask me a question. warealtor.org. Follow the links to the legal hotline. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.